All righty. I am not going to take up much more of your time this morning. I know many of you have tuned in because we have an amazing guest speaker as our opening keynote. It is Lee McIntyre. He has many books, but he has this new book here. Can you all see that? How to Talk to a Science Denier. You can buy that wherever you get your books. I also say I think we have some copies for sale in our museum bookstore for those who are museum goers and want to buy some books from our museum. But you can buy that wherever you can get it. Some of his other books have been absolutely instrumental to the work that we do at the Institute. For those of you who have had the pleasure of stepping into George's office, there's, I don't know, George, he's probably backstage giving me the number right now. It's probably around 100 books or so written on his board. And a lot of them have helped shape the kind of thinking and the philosophy and some of our work at the Institute, including some of Lee's earlier work. So we are really thrilled to have him here. Lee is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University, as well as an instructor in ethics at Harvard Extension School. He's the author of this new book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, and including many other books, as I alluded to, including Post-Truth, if you all have not read that one as well. Lee, thank you so much for being here today with us. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Awesome. So Lee's going to just give us a little bit of a presentation, and so we all get to kind of sit back and enjoy and hear some of his words of wisdom, and then I think we'll have a few minutes when he's done for a little conversation and Q&A. I've definitely got some questions myself, but if you all have questions, definitely type them in, and I'll try to work them into a conversation with Lee. So Lee, take it from here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Appreciate it. The first thing I want to do is thank you for inviting me to be your keynote speaker today. This is a real honor, and I wish I could be there in person, as everybody else does, I'm sure. The second thing I'm going to do, though, is to immediately wear out my welcome by suggesting that your conference might be mistitled. Now, I understand that misinformation is a terrible problem and that it has downstream effects on science, trust, institutions, our society, and just about everything else that we care about. But I think the real culprit these days is properly labeled not misinformation, but disinformation. Let me explain. Misinformation is a mistake. It's when we say that some falsehood is true when it's not, but this happened by accident. Say I'm out walking my dogs and a passing car stops and asks for directions to Boston. I say, go down 3 blocks, make a left, and get on Beacon Street. That'll take you straight to Boston. Easy enough, and the person happily pulls away. Then to my mortification, I realize that I'm not where I thought I was, and that I've told them to go exactly the wrong way. I said to make a left on Beacon, when I should have said right. Now he's going to be headed out to Wellesley, and if he keeps going, eventually the New York border. I made a mistake, but it wasn't malicious. That's misinformation. Now imagine by contrast that I intentionally wanted to misdirect someone because I had a gang of friends who were waiting to carjack a Mercedes, and I took this opportunity to give the motorist directions that would lead him directly to them so that they could take his car, chop it up, and sell it for parts. In this case, perhaps I might have also told him to go left rather than right, but now it's disinformation because I did it on purpose. I did it because it served my interests for the motorist to believe a falsehood. And that's where the entire this distinction between misinformation and disinformation becomes relevant for science. I maintain that the reason we live in an age in which there's so much science denial about the climate, COVID, and so much else, and where we have witnessed such rapidly diminishing trust in science, is not because it's some sort of accident or mistake that this false information somehow leaks out onto the internet. It's instead the result of a deliberate campaign of deception and falsehood that someone cooked up to mislead us. There are forces at work who want us to believe that false things about the climate and COVID, about evolution and vaccines and GMOs, not because it serves our interests, but instead because it benefits the interests of the people who are creating and spreading these falsehoods. Science denial is not an accident. It's a lie. People don't wake up one day wondering whether the California forest fires were due to a Jewish space laser or whether Bill Gates put microchips into their COVID vaccines. Those beliefs are the result of a deliberate propaganda campaign that's meant to create doubt and distrust. Now, of course, to the person who's going in the wrong direction, you might wonder why it's worse that the mistake was deliberate. But as you can see in my original example, it's because the consequences can be quite terrible for the person who's being misled, depending on the stakes of the lie. The difference between driving to Wellesley and turning around versus driving to Wellesley and getting carjacked is not trivial. Imagine asking a scientist why fraud is worse than error. They'll give you a funny look. Anyone who's ever done a little science understands that it's hard enough to do science without having to deal with people who are cheating. Of course, even mistakes in science aren't really welcome, but at least you might be able to learn from them. But what's the point of building on somebody's work when even they know it isn't true, when it's fraudulent? And I submit that the same holds with the distinction between misinformation and disinformation. It matters why you're driving the wrong way. But now I want to make one more quick qualification. I mean, you knew I was a philosopher, right? You knew this was coming. Couldn't you say that to the person who acts on bad information, it hardly matters what the original intent was, right? Imagine somebody who's heard disinformation, but then they share it thinking that it's true. Doesn't it at that point become misinformation? Now, I'm a philosopher, and we could probably spend a couple of weeks sorting this out, but let's not. Because the important point I'm trying to make here is that if you want to fight bad information, you have to know where it's coming from and why. And if you're trying to defend science from science deniers and other charlatans, it's important to keep in mind not just that they believe false things, but that they believe false things because they have been lied to. Science deniers are duped. They're doing someone else's bidding. It's important to understand that they believe it, but it's also important to understand where they're getting the information from, because that will help us to fight it. Now, as with most effective lies, a science denial campaign usually starts with a kernel of truth. And it employs a tactic that we all think of as very good and, in fact, quite scientific, which is doubt. Scientists doubt things, don't they? And in fact, it's good that they do so. As Carl Sagan once said, the amazing thing about scientists is that they're both open-minded and skeptical at the same time. Now, the trick is to be open-minded enough to want to learn new things that might change your mind about what's true, but then immediately suspend your judgment over any particular hypothesis until you hear the evidence for it. You always want to test things. Doubt in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, because doubt about any particular scientific finding can be overcome with sufficient evidence. Indeed, this is how scientists reason. Scientists are skeptical. This is why they turn to the evidence. That's why they test their hypotheses. But the real problem with science denial comes when doubt morphs over into distrust, because doubt can be overcome with evidence, but distrust cannot. The goal of disinformation is not merely to raise doubt, but to weaponize it into distrust, which eventually becomes denial. This occurs when our fellow citizens are encouraged not just to disbelieve certain scientific facts, but to distrust the scientists who have discovered them, to see them as biased or even liars. That undermines the process by which scientific knowledge is created in the first place. In an earlier book called The Scientific Attitude, I argued that what's most special about science is that scientists care about evidence and they're willing to change their mind on the basis of new evidence. Although they may start with doubt, when the evidence is sufficient to overcome their reservations, a good scientist will give their assent. This is not to say that they necessarily believe that a hypothesis has been proven to be true or that we're certain about it, because those are unreachable goals. No scientist can ever prove a theory. The people who are asking you to prove that the vaccines are safe, you can't even prove that aspirin is safe, because proof is an impossible goal. Science is not deductive logic. It's not Euclidean geometry. But when there's sufficient evidence, it is rational to believe that a theory is true. That is, until new evidence mounts to change your mind. In the philosophical trade, we call that fallibilism. And it means that you give your assent to a well-corroborated belief while always holding out the idea that in the long run, it might not be true. That's simply a rational way to form one's beliefs in the empirical world. We assert what we think is true, and then we revise as necessary. Now, I want you to compare this to the way that science deniers reason. A few years back, I went to the Flat Earth International Conference right there in Denver, where I spent 2 days mingling with folks who genuinely believed that the Earth was flat, that Antarctica wasn't a continent, but instead was an ice wall around the perimeter to keep the water from falling off, that there was a dome over the top, and that we'd never been to the moon because we couldn't get outside the dome. They believed all this because they distrusted the scientists who told them otherwise. To them, it was all part of a giant conspiracy whereby the scientists were benefiting somehow from keeping this a secret. But this, of course, wreaked havoc with the flat earthers' claim that their beliefs were not based on faith, but instead good evidence, which is what they all told me. Because who could trust evidence that's provided in experiments that they hadn't done themselves? I mean, who were they actually trusting? And if they demanded proof as the standard for belief, which they surely did when they talked to me about why I was a globalist, why did they believe in flat Earth? They didn't have proof for that either. And so in some ways they thought, well, neither of us have proof. So, either belief is justified, which is just wrong. It's not just that the flat earthers' beliefs are wrong. It's that they were reasoning about them in the wrong way. Nothing could convince them. They would never say what, if any, evidence might compel them to change their minds. They didn't have the scientific attitude. So it's not just that their conclusions were mistaken. It's that they were not willing to reason about an empirical matter like a scientist would. And the reason is that they distrusted all scientists. And now I'm going to say that it works this way for all science denial. Some years back, a few researchers, including one of the speakers later in this program, Stephen Lewandowski, found that all science deniers reason in the same way. This is not to say that the content of their beliefs is all the same, or that if you're a science denier about one thing, you're necessarily a science denier about everything. Rather, it means that whether the topic is climate denial, flat Earth, anti-vax, anti-evolution, or something else, all science deniers follow the same flawed 5-step reasoning strategy, which goes like this. Number 1, they cherry pick evidence. Number 2, they believe in conspiracy theories. Number 3, they engage in illogical reasoning. Number 4, they rely on fake experts. And number 5, this is my favorite, they think that science has to be perfect in order to be credible. Now, these 5 tropes sound pretty familiar, don't they? We all understand that vaccine deniers cherry pick unvetted claims from the VAERS website or rely on fake experts on the internet, some of whom, by the way, have something to sell, to support their spurious claims. But here's the payoff. Because by understanding this flawed reasoning strategy, it allows you to push back against science deniers, to address not just the content of their beliefs, but the flawed logic behind them. Consider, for instance, the 5th trope, the idea that science has to be perfect to be credible. This is a common one amongst science deniers who will often say, quote, just give me proof. And then they'll say, aha, when you can't do it. They'll say, quote, let's wait for more evidence on climate change. Or they'll say, just prove to me that the vaccines are safe. They don't understand how science works. They're reasoning about empirical beliefs in an illogical way because when you're dealing with inductive reasoning strategies, you cannot have proof. You have to rely on warrant and evidence, not certainty. To a science denier, though, they feel virtuous for their great skepticism. They often say that they're the true skeptics. I had many flat earthers tell me that they were more scientific than the scientists because of their great skepticism. But they don't really understand what skepticism means either. Science deniers are what I call cafeteria skeptics. Example, the flat earthers, they didn't believe in the shape of the earth, and they thought that all the airline pilots were lying about that. But many of them flew there, and they used their phones to live tweet the event, not realizing that some of that traffic went off of satellites. Cafeteria skeptics are not usually anti-science, but instead just skeptical about the piece of science that treads on their ideological beliefs or whatever piece of their identity they want to protect. This is why they're so inconsistent in the way they reason about evidence. They insist on a standard of evidence that's tantamount to proof for the things that they don't want to believe, but then turn around and ask for almost no evidence at all for the things that they do want to believe. They embrace this double standard that would never be tolerated in science. Instead of being skeptics, science deniers are actually quite gullible. Now, it's worth reflecting on all this for a moment, because thinking about this flawed reasoning strategy helps us to see what we can do to fight back. 2 summers ago, there was a study in Nature Human Behavior by Cornelia Bache and Philip Schmid, which showed that one can push back against science deniers, and sometimes even convince them to give up their irrational beliefs based on understanding the 5-trope strategy. But it's hard, and it doesn't always work. It works better than anything else. They also talked about content rebuttal, which I'll let you read the study to find out what that is. But this idea of technique rebuttal, pushing back on the reasoning strategy, worked just as well. But it's a salvage strategy. It's what you do when the disease of denialism has already spread to a virgin population, and there's nothing else you can do but try to treat it because the people are already infected with the denialist beliefs. But now I'm going to ask an important question. What if you could get to the vulnerable people first, before they were radicalized? Because remember, science deniers are made, not born. Their beliefs are created by someone whose interests are served by radicalizing them with disinformation. And by understanding that, maybe we can address this problem before it gets any worse. You can stop a disease by treating the sick, but you can also try to remove the pump handle, as they did with the cholera outbreak over 100 years ago, that's getting everybody infected in the first place. One way to do this is to pre-bunk false beliefs by publicizing the flawed reasoning strategy that all science deniers use to arrive at them. Sander van der Linden and others have done research on this, also reported in Nature Human Behavior. But another mechanism to fight back is to expose the fact that the science deniers are being duped, that they're victims, as I said, that they're doing someone else's bidding without even realizing it. Don't forget where we started with this. Science denial is based on disinformation. It's the weaponization of doubt, which means that somebody must have weaponized it. But who? The manufacture of doubt into modern science denial began in the 1950s, when the CEOs of the 4 largest tobacco companies met at the Plaza Hotel in New York City and hired a public relations specialist to advise them what to do about a forthcoming study which said that there was a link between smoking and lung cancer. His advice? Fight the science. They accomplished this through a public relations campaign that involved full-page ads in American newspapers, doing their own research in a precursor to the American Tobacco Institute, and creating a false alternative narrative that they could then feed out to journalists, editors, publishers, and others who were encouraged to tell the other side of the story about smoking and lung cancer. They wanted them to admit that there was no proven causal link between smoking and cancer, which is of course true, because anybody who's ever studied David Hume and the problem of induction understands all causal links cannot be proven. No causal links can be proven because of inductive reasoning. They're less than certain. That's just how inductive reasoning works. The tobacco companies, my dog is groaning, she didn't like that phrase. The tobacco companies didn't need to prove that smoking did not cause cancer. All they needed to do was create enough doubt about whether it did to continue to sell cigarettes, which they did for the next 40 years. As Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway report in their wonderful book, Merchants of Doubt, this tobacco strategy was then followed over the next 6 decades in denialist campaigns about acid rain, the ozone hole, and later about climate change, so that special interests could profit. But a dangerous thing happened during those 6 or 7 decades, because on several topics, science denial morphed from being just about profit to being about politics, to being about ideology. The goal was no longer merely to make money, but to protect one's sacred beliefs. For that, they needed to create an army of deniers, of true believers. And for that, the manufacture of doubt wasn't enough. The goal became distrust, which could be created only through the cynical manufacture of disinformation. The point of a full-fledged denialist campaign is not just to create doubt about some particular scientific fact, but to foment enough alienation and polarization to divide the world into us versus them, so that folks might begin to distrust scientists in general. If you don't think that can happen, look at what's happened with COVID. Look at the demonization of Dr. Fauci and other epidemiologists. After all, what use are facts if you don't trust the people who are providing them? People sometimes think that they can fight back against science denial by sharing facts, but I ask them to consider the question of trust. This is called the information deficit model. Will people really be convinced by your facts if they don't trust you? And the answer is no, which is why you have to think of science denial as not just about doubt, but distrust. And to get over it, you have to figure out a way to overcome distrust. Let's talk a little more about, COVID vaccine denial. If it were motivated merely by doubt about whether the vaccines caused infertility, it could be overcome by data showing that they didn't. But if you look at how people have come to have such suspicions, it's because they've been fed propaganda that encourages them to think that Dr. Fauci and the CDC and the FDA are lying to us. When you enter a world where the skeptics become us and the scientists become them, the battle is already half lost. Because at that point, the facts don't really matter. Why would you believe any alleged facts if they were shared by a liar? In April 2020, just a month into the pandemic, a story appeared in a publication called the Oriental Review, which claimed that any future COVID vaccines developed in the West would have biometric microchips in them, courtesy of Bill Gates, who had taken out a patent on this technology numbered 060606. At the bottom of the story, there were buttons to make it easy to share on Facebook and Twitter. What was not immediately apparent from this story, though, is that it had been created by Russian intelligence, which was pumping out COVID denial propaganda to 4 of the English language news outlets that it controlled, one of which was the Oriental Review. There's more on this in the Wall Street Journal series for those of you who are interested in following up. This was not the first time that Russia had been involved in creating and disseminating disinformation that undermined Western confidence in science about topics like climate change, GMOs, vaccines, and a host of other health-related topics. There was a terrific article in the New York Times 2 years ago entitled "Putin's Long War Against American Science," which tells the story of how Vladimir Putin's Russia has for decades been trying to undermine trust in Western scientific institutions. The story about microchips in the vaccines was just the latest in a long line of disinformation that was intended to destabilize American society. And those sorts of campaigns have been wildly effective. By May 2020, CBS News reported on a poll which showed that 44% of Republican voters believe that any COVID vaccines might have biometric microchips in them. Now, that's quite a payoff for 1 month's propaganda. And you know the rest of the story from here. Or do you? I'm not saying that all of the scientific disinformation on the internet has come out of a Russian troll farm. But I am saying that some of it did. And that the purpose of this is to exploit the existing fault lines in American society and keep us at each other's throats so that we're less likely to have the time and resolve to pay attention to what other countries are doing. If you want to read more about this, read Thomas Ridd's recent work, Active Measures, which talks about the Russian campaign for AIDS denial, and way back to when Russia really invented modern disinformation in the 1920s with Dzerzhinsky, who was the propaganda czar for Lenin. Given the political climate we've just lived through, it's not hard to see how the politicization of science denial has now become a weapon, and worse yet, an example that's blazed the trail from science denial to reality denial about things like an election outcome. It's a dangerous moment in history, and the stakes are high. If we can't figure out what to do about the problem of disinformation in this country and around the world, a number of our treasured institutions like science and democracy might be at stake. I submit that part of the answer in fighting back is that we have to learn how to talk to one another again. And in my recent book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, I recommend a strategy for respectful conversation with those who are distrustful of us and of science. But that's only part of the solution. We also have to try to figure out how to stop the flow of disinformation so easily onto the internet, where it's picked up and amplified by those with nefarious intent. What we really have before us, I think, are three problems: the creation of disinformation, the amplification of disinformation, and the uptake of disinformation. And it's going to take everything we've got to fight all three of these problems. But the first thing that we have to do is recognize that the real problem that we're up against, that this is not due to misinformation. It's due to disinformation. Someone is doing this on purpose. We have to face this and not hide behind euphemisms or the reluctance to name names. It's time to stop asking merely, why do people believe such crazy stuff? And instead start to ask, who wants them to believe it? We are in an information war, and the first step to winning an information war is to admit that we're in one. Thank you. I'm ready for your questions.
You're ready for questions. I'll say from the audience and then from myself too. So thank you, Lee. That was excellent. I was rapidly listening and taking notes, and there's a lot there. You know, you went to this Flat Earthers conference, right? I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your thinking about, you know, I'm going to go there and do this. What led up to that decision of I'm going to go there? And then maybe talk a little bit about that experience.
So I wanted to, this was at the beginning of my research for the new book. And I wanted to see if I could talk to the worst science deniers that I could imagine. My eventual goal was to go out and talk to climate deniers and others. And I sort of thought at the beginning, well, the flat earthers aren't hurting anyone, but they're pretty bad science deniers. So let me see what I can do. And what I learned is that their strategy was the same as any other science denier. And it was very hard to get them to change their mind because they were pretty hardcore. But that through listening and respectful conversation and remaining calm, I could get them to listen to me. And that was a very important thing. I don't think that flat Earth is based on some sort of foreign intelligence. To me, that's the one that sticks out like a sore thumb. I really can't figure it out. I can trace back the information on vaccines, on COVID denial, on climate change, on GMOs. Some of that comes out of foreign intelligence. Flat Earth, I don't know who's benefiting from it. I don't know who's making any money on it. It doesn't really make any sense to me. But it did seem to me to be following the exact same strategy. So what I learned is that science deniers are capable of believing almost anything if their identity is at stake. This is not just what they believed, this was who they are. And you have to keep that in mind when you're speaking to them. It's not like they're going to change their mind if you give them the facts. Nobody's going to tear off their lanyard and say what a fool I was. You have to try to build up that individual trust. And like I said, that's a salvage operation. That's when it's too late. They've already been radicalized. They go to YouTube, they watch 20 flat Earth videos, say, well, I can't refute this, it must be true. And then they drop down the rabbit hole.
So what's your plans going forward with you know, once you've thought a little bit about the flat Earth? I know I've got other questions too, but I'm curious. I mean, is there a strategy going forward for you in that, or is that just something, you know, the building relationships? That's a lot of people doing a lot of effort over a long period of time. So what's your hope there?
So here's the thing. I wrote the book How to Talk to a Science Denier because I need an army of people. I mean, think of how much of the population is sick with conspiracy theorist beliefs. And we need an entire army of people talking to them in a respectful way. And I think that the Bates and Schmidt article shows how to do it. It shows that you don't have to be a scientist to talk to a science denier. They showed that this technique rebuttal based on the 5 tropes was just as effective as content rebuttal, which is when a climatologist engages you on climate change. I mean, that works too, but anybody can do this. Now, sadly, there's more work that needs to be done because, what are we going to do about foreign intelligence creating disinformation? I don't know. What I do know is that we can do something about the internet, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, sharing disinformation as they do is the pinch point. That's the problem. The creation of disinformation can't really infect people unless it's amplified, and I think that's what makes things so much worse these days. And it polarizes us into tribes of, we can go find somebody else who believes what we believe. There are other people who are thinking about this. I heard a wonderful paper. Again, I'm going to name check Stephen Lewandowski. He gave a wonderful paper recently that I was there in person for, where he talked about the algorithms on Twitter and on Facebook and how those are secret. And if they were made more transparent, we might be able to make some progress there. I don't want to steal his thunder. He may be talking about that later. But like I say, there are other folks working on this problem and other aspects of this problem. And it will take everyone doing it and not giving up, not misunderstanding and thinking, oh, this is about misinformation. We can't do anything. We have to learn to live with it. But understanding, how to push back.
Absolutely. Thank you. I know our audience is always going to be looking for these tools and tips. And I think you gave us at a high level view, but I really liked that initial framing. I think you set it up as it kind of starts with doubt, right? And we can use evidence at that time when there's doubt to help with that conversation. That moves to distrust. And then that potentially moves to denial, right? There's kind of, it seems like this layering on effect that happens.
That's right.
So what are some really just simple, it's nothing simple, right? But what are some really key intersection points for all of those different pathways before we get to that denial stage? You mentioned evidence for the doubt. I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more.
The best way, well, keep yourself from becoming a denier, right? That's the first pinch point, right? But once you've done, and my friend Andy Norman has a book called Mental Immunity. So if you don't think you can do that, read that book and you can learn how for yourself. But once you're immune from bad ideas, you can go out there and help other people. And the main way to do that, I think, is to talk to people who disagree with you and stop yelling at them. And that includes family members, right? I can't tell you how many people said, oh no, over Thanksgiving, my Uncle Joe is going to be there and he's an anti-vaxxer. Well, so you don't want to have that conversation. I understand it's uncomfortable, but those are the people who maybe already trust and love you. And that's where you can make the most impact. The other thing you can do is motivate yourself. Start reading about the times when this has worked. Google, I used to be an anti-vaxxer. This is how I changed my mind. Google Jim Bridenstine, who was one of the worst climate deniers in Congress, changed his mind when he became head of NASA. How does this happen? It always happens the same way because they engage with people who they grow to trust. So you can actually do this. It's very hard to do, but you can actually do this. This is a successful strategy. And I think also the most humane one, because otherwise the worry that I have right now is that science denial is the tip of the iceberg, because science denial has now metastasized into reality denial. It's not just doubts about empirical facts about science. It's about our other institutions, our governmental institutions. It's about democracy itself. If we don't get a handle on this problem, there's a lot at risk. Reality, belief in reality that we all share is at risk, not just science.
So we have some questions coming from the audience, but I wanted to pick up on something you just said, and this isn't a well-formulated question, so I'll try to muddle through it. But this idea of, again, having these conversations, building these relationships, making these connections, when communities are separated in a variety of different ways, right? And you mentioned about identity, whether that's flat Earth or we all have our own identities, right? And we develop these identities over time, and our identities change and they morph, and we can change our minds over time, even though we know it's really hard to really change our mind about significant issues. Right. But those are very associated often with those groups and those communities that we identify with as a form of connection, right? It kind of gets back to this evolutionary sense. So, that's really hard, right? Like, particularly, when you are trying to, make inroads and make connections with a community that you are maybe not connected with, right? A bunch of scientists working up in a national lab together, and the communities and people that they associate with, right? That, it's a kind of a, what I'm trying to get at. How does that work?
I mean, I went to a flat Earth convention. That was hard. It was hard to walk in the front door, right? So I get it. But they were not angry at me. They were willing to talk to me. And I would say that's available for anyone. It can feel intimidating to talk to people that you disagree with. You probably already know some people who are deniers about various things, but they just don't want to tell you. Do you bring up the topic? Are you willing to have those conversations? The amazing thing that I've learned over my research for this book is that simply talking to people makes you like them more, makes you trust them more. And you have more in common with people than you think. So, if people have the attitude, I cannot be bothered with talking to a science denier, you're being a denialist yourself, because Bates and Schmidt have shown that you could have an effect, but you're denying that you could, right? So be motivated, get out there. And, you shouldn't go into it thinking, oh boy, I'm going to convince them today. Think of just having a conversation, keep the relationship open. Don't start pruning people off either on Facebook or in your real life that you disagree with, because that just makes them trust fewer and fewer people, and then they're more vulnerable to disinformation. Remember, that's one goal of the people who are creating disinformation. Polarization and alienation makes it much easier to control the people who are the believers. You don't want them getting information from outside. So preserve your relationships. Don't cut somebody off.
I appreciate that, having that empathy, right?
Yes.
It's really important. So thank you. I want to take in a couple audience questions here, Lee, and then perhaps we can wrap up here and just at the top of the hour with a final kind of, hopeful viewpoint that you want to give us. I always like to try to get people to give me a little bit of hope at the end. So one of our guests, who I think is a scientist too, because I know this person, would it almost be better to not be a scientist when talking with a science denier, so that we do not appear as biased? So what's your advice to scientists?
Yeah, I think being a scientist is an awesome thing. And I think that there is a respect that people have, even science deniers have, for scientists. It's just that they have a stereotype. Most people who are science deniers have never met a scientist. And if you read some of the accounts of, times when people change their mind, it's when they met a scientist. Google, it will take off by wildfire, Washington Post. There's a story there about a measles outbreak in Vancouver, Washington, where the governor of the state sent a bunch of scientists down to talk with people, and it worked. Scientists are warm, wonderful people. They're curious. They're trustworthy. And when people meet them, they find that out. Frank Luntz is a Republican pollster, and he pulled together a focus group with 20 people who didn't want to take their COVID vaccines. And he tried every message in the book, every person in the book. And you know what worked? A scientist, but a scientist who was humble, a scientist who didn't pretend that he could prove anything or that he was certain about the result, but said, we don't know everything, but here's what we do know. And here's why we know that. And here's what we are trying to learn. And here's how we'll know when we, have more information. If you don't apologize for uncertainty, it's an important part of science, and be humble. If scientists do that, I think we've really got a lot. I think there's your optimism. Scientists have a special role. There's the Alan Alda Center at Stony Brook. There's the Center for Public Engagement with Science at Cincinnati. There are training programs for how scientists can learn how to talk to the general public. Scientists have special credibility, and they should use it.
Great. Another audience member was questioning about belief systems and how do you account for belief systems. And I'd also add in and experiences where something like a doctor has failed them, right, over time, and they've built up mistrust. How do you approach that when they have felt mistreated, perhaps by the science community or medical field?
It's a great question because it zeroes in on this idea that when people have a bad experience, what happens? It's a breach of trust. They think, well, that doctor didn't treat me well, so I'm not going to go back to the hospital and maybe see another doctor for my checkup, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes you'll hear people use that as their reason why they don't want to get vaccinated. Look, listen to their story, and then tell your story about why you trust your doctor. That can be amazingly effective. I mean, just to listen. The person who builds mistrust is the person who goes to their doctor and says, I'm a little bit worried about taking this vaccine. I've heard some things. Can you, explain to me whether the COVID vaccine causes infertility? And then that's a real opportunity. But then when the physician says, I'm surprised at you. Why would you believe such nonsense? Where did you get that? Nicki Minaj? Well, wow. Distrust is built right at that moment. It's important to listen to, why people have that distrust. I'm going to say this. A lot of the flat earthers I spoke to were hurt. They felt betrayed. I mean, they believed in evidence. They didn't know how to reason about it. They believed in doubt, though they didn't use it in the right way. There was room for them on the science team, but they felt betrayed by scientists. They felt betrayed by government officials, people in power. It was an interesting part of their identity and their dynamic. And I think the solution for that is to listen to what they have to say and then share your experience.
Right. There's the power of connecting through emotions and story, right? And story can evoke those emotions. So
yes.
Okay. Right. We have one more question, and this may lead you into your hopeful future question. Okay. Tom Heister, who's a friend of the Institute, says, do you feel this descent down the rabbit hole that we're experiencing now is a one-way trip? Or does history suggest that we might somehow be a little cyclical and that this isn't going to be forever, and then perhaps there's a two-way interaction here happening? So what's that? Is there, whether you have a historical example or just your thoughts on how do we get out of this?
The Dark Ages were long, and we pulled out of them. This is not the worst period in human history. This is not the worst period for science denial. I just got back from a trip to Rome where I stood before the statue of Giordano Bruno in the Campo de' Fiori. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600 for believing that the stars were other suns that had planets going around them. The consequences of science denial can be, the pushback on science can be much worse than it is now. We're at a bad moment because we have not figured out what to do about the most recent technological innovation that's brought all this disinformation to our feet. Propaganda has been around for a long time. Disinformation based on, as a source of war has been around since the 1920s. But the internet is new still comparatively, and we haven't figured out what to do. If you look back at radio, TV, even newspapers, there were dire predictions about, and they were misused at first. It was kind of, the wild times until they figured out how to regulate them. We will someday figure out the appropriate way to regulate the internet. And I think that will begin to help us on this. But we need to get started on that. And I refer to the other people who know more than I do about this sort of thing. I noticed that you've got somebody coming, your other guest speaker, the wonderful Center for Countering Digital Hate. You know a lot about that. And so, we all need an oar in our hand to work on this.
Thank you. Lee, what's next for you?
I am working on the other two aspects of the problem. So I've written this book called How to Talk to a Science Denier, and it's about what to do once, people believe this stuff. I'm now working on the problem of disinformation and thinking about where it comes from and how to combat it on the internet. Thinking in a philosophical sense, not necessarily in a technical sense, but I'm just trying to think of the larger problem.
Excited. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. It was an amazing conversation, a really great start to kind of kick off a lot of our thinking about this. Really grateful for your time, and congrats on the new book, and best of luck with your future endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.